there, welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crowngraves Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're not going to be doing a what if Russia became Catholic. We're going to kick that for you a few weeks, and the reason being is because Dark Phoenix in the comment of the last video suggested that I do a part 2. So I highly recommend that you go and check out that previous video for more of the historical context. But in the course of this video, what we're going to do is essentially skip forward to the 20th century to see what the long-term effects of Russia never becoming conquered by the Mongols. So we have to give a massive shout out to Dark Phoenix, like we said, and also we have to give a shout out to all the other people who left a comment in the last video. So this is a new thing that we're doing for this channel. So if you leave a comment in the comment section, then you will get a shout out in the next video. I haven't responded to all the comments just yet. I know that, I'm getting onto it, all right? Just for now, take the shout out as, yeah, that's the best you're going to get for the moment. But, of course, if you like all that, don't forget, obviously, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget to check out our many other videos in this channel. I promise that you will not be disappointed. And also, many of you have not subscribed to my second channel, that is SKP Film. So definitely go and subscribe to that. So far we've looked at all of the classic Disney films, and we're going to go on to look at many other directors as well. So definitely stay tuned for that. And yeah, so anyway, without further ado, we're going to dive straight down into the scenario. So buckle up and let's go for the ride. So this scenario here, we're having it set around 1913/14. And what we're imagining with this is that instead of the Russia that we end up having in real life, instead what we're going to end up having is this one, which is based off of the Novgorod Republic. So as we covered in that last video, Novgorod Republic was very democratic. It was relatively liberal. It was relatively, well, pre-capitalist, and it was relatively egalitarian, which is in stark contrast to the very autocratic nature of the Russian Empire under the Tsars. So what effects would this likely have had here? So you're fast forwarding almost 700 years after what would have been the Mongol conquest. So how could things have turned out differently? Like, what would Russia be in this time? So the first thing I have to say is that territorially, this Russian Empire today, I believe, would be much larger than it otherwise was. And the reason being is because of the so-called Great Game. So the Great Game was a contest between the British and the Russians, and this essentially was because obviously Britain was the global hegemon, and they wanted to keep Russia in its place. So whereas Russia had ambitions in the Balkans, where it had ambitions in Central Asia, and also where it had ambitions in the Far East, Britain and other Western powers kept Russia in check. So for instance, if we look at the Balkans, they wanted to basically have control over what is now Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Greece, etc., etc. And also they want to expand their conquest in Central Asia all the way down into Afghanistan. And then in the Far East, they wanted to have control over Manchuria, they want to have control over Korea, and also they want to have a lot of influence over Japan. So within our own timeline, Russia was kept in check because for two reasons. One, it was obviously an autocratic state, and so a global hegemon like Britain was very hostile to its autocracy. And then second of all, Russia, because of its economy, because of its society, it was just not industrialized. It was not modernized. It was not truly westernized. And therefore, it didn't have the strength or the capabilities to actually impose its will and to override what the British and others wanted to do. If you look at the Crimean War, for instance, if you look at the Russo-Japanese War, for instance, they were kept in check multiple times by Western forces, right? Or in the case of Japan here, they underestimated Japan. They expected them to be a complete walkover, and the Japanese, because they had westernized better than Russia had, they end up basically defeating the Russians. But in this scenario here, where Russia obviously is a lot stronger, they have a lot more capacity. So to speak now on the economy of the Russian Empire, what we could already see from our own timeline is that Russia by 1913 was already the fourth largest economy in the world. So it had already beaten Britain, which, you know, it was not including the British Empire, and it was just behind where Germany was. However, what we have to note is that the GDP per capita of the Russian Empire at this time was way, way behind its competitors. So even if you look at Britain, even if you look at Germany, even if you look at Poland, which obviously was divided between the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire, much of what is modern day Poland was under the Russian Empire. And yet still, Poland's GDP per capita was roughly 50% larger than that of Russia. So in this scenario, even if we were to say that Russia's level of development under this Novgorod Republic and as it extended into becoming a Russian empire, let's say that it even matches the GDP per capita of Poland. Well, in that case there, what we would see is that the GDP of Russia would be second only to the United States. So obviously during the Cold War from I believe 1947 to sometime in the 1980s, Soviet Union was the second largest economy in the world, second only to the United States. And so actually in this case here, with Russia having much more economic development at a much earlier stage, they would actually have been second only to the United States from much earlier on in the century. Now, constitutionally speaking, because obviously Russia wouldn't have been an autocracy, it would have been a more constitutional monarchy. And it probably more likely not would have had very close ties with England. So we're going to do that in our upcoming video, so more on that later. But yeah, so it would probably have very close ties with England, and therefore many of its institutions would have been largely copied. So within the Novgorod Republic, all the way back in the 13th century, they already had these things called vetches, which we covered in the last video, which were public assemblies. Now these public assemblies, they obviously had a very limited franchise in the grand scheme of things, and yet still, at the time, about half of all Novgorodian men owned some sort of property. And so even if we were to extend the franchise just to property owning men, that would already be a large segment of the population. And I believe probably by 1913, 1914, there's every argument to be made that universal male suffrage could have been granted to the Russian people as early as this time, because this is already in place in Germany. And actually, I think that the German Empire at this time probably stands as the best example of what Russia could have been. The reason I say that is because obviously you had a Kaiser, but you still had the Reichstag, which was the German parliament, and the socialists there, they had a large amount of sway because obviously you had a large industrialized working class. But still, I believe that as a result of the constitutional monarchy, I believe that people like the Bolsheviks would never have been able to rise to power. If you look at Germany, for instance, obviously later on you had the Spartacus, so definitely check that video out for more information. But for the most part, first of all, obviously that failed. And the reason it failed is because most of the left-wing movement within Germany basically made peace with the establishment and was more in favour of reforming capitalism than overthrowing it. And so much in the same way with regard to Russia, we already see within the election of 1917, the social revolutionaries, they were the dominant party within the Russian assembly. And so I think that much in the same way with Russia, you probably would have had something very similar. And so, as a result of this, I can't really see a scenario in which Russia goes communist, which obviously has long-term ramifications for the rest of the 20th century. Also as well, we should say that anti-Semitism was a major thing in Europe at the time, but how it manifested in the Russian Empire at the time, as opposed to the rest of Europe, was by this stage still markedly different. So if you check out the channel by Sam Aronhow, he's really brilliant. Definitely go and check out his videos. And we've also covered a great deal of Jewish history on this channel as well. So yeah, definitely go and check those videos out as well. But the point is that Russia at this time was more focused on the religious aspect of anti-Semitism, whereas much as Europe had moved towards scientific anti-Semitism, which, it still was anti-Semitism, it's still terrible. But it's a thing where, whereas the rest of people in Europe kind of saw the Jews as outsiders for, racial reasons, for Russia, they basically saw them as being one of two things. One, they were Christ killers still. Yeah, so this is obviously very medieval in their thinking. Then second of all, they were a convenient scapegoat for the Tsarist government. So basically the autocracy was able to blame the Jews on all the problems of the empire. And this is why you had pogroms, and this is why you end up having the eventual mass exodus of many Jewish people leaving from the Russian Empire to settle in places like America. So in this timeline here, the Jews would still have been hated on, much like you had in other places in Central Europe, like for instance Germany, but more likely than not, you wouldn't have seen the same level of pogroms, and as a result, America today would be much less Jewish than it currently is, and also many other places such as England and France as well, where many of these Jews fled to. So Russian Empire would probably have extended all the way into the Eastern Balkans. It probably would have control over Afghanistan, probably would have control over Manchuria, Korea, maybe even Hokkaido, which is obviously the northern island in Japan, and this would have probably come at the end of the Russo-Japanese War. And also it probably would have had control over Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, which would have given Russian Navy access to the Turkish Straits, and therefore they would have had more influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now the British in their own timeline, they stopped this because obviously it was a threat to their empire. However, if Russia was more liberal, they probably would have just seen them as just another European power, and therefore the need to kind of like strangle Russia would not have been as strong. So a lot of Russophobia, which took place throughout the 19th century, where most places in Europe basically saw them as an Asiatic horde. In this scenario here, where there's no Mongol invasion, there's no kind of this racial kind of narrative that can kind of run, where Russia is essentially just another European nation, they would have basically treated them in much the same way as they treated other European powers. So their imperial ambitions wouldn't have been kept in check nearly as much as was otherwise the case in our own timeline. And so when we talk about World War One, so obviously I think World War One still definitely would have happened in this timeline. However, what would have been different about it is that Russia would have been much more economically strong, and this is something which we're going to cover in a future video as well, about what if World War One had ended much earlier. If Russia had got its act together and had the industrial capacity and the military capacity to actually win World War One, then more likely than not, what would have ended up happening is that the Germans and the Austrians would have been defeated. So this would have meant that there would have been no stab in the back myth. And so, as a result of that, a certain Austrian painter wouldn't have ever been able to rise to prominence, and therefore much of what ended up happening in World War II probably wouldn't have been happening within our own timeline. And if there's no World War II and there's no rise of communism, then more likely than not there would have been no Cold War, and therefore the entire 20th century would have ended up completely different from how we currently see it today. And so, if we look at Russia today in 2023, what we can basically see would basically be a very strong country, a very relatively rich country, and also a country which wouldn't be so maligned in the world, which wouldn't be so feared in the world, and which also would have lost many of its imperialist ambitions. And the reason for that is because in the 1960s, most of the European powers gave up their colonies. And so what we can probably imagine is that the outer extremities of this empire, which we had already mentioned, so these are the imaginary conquered lands that we kind of spoke about, they probably would have been given away. And also many places in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and also Finland, Poland, and the Baltics would also probably be given away, which would have meant that Russia today would probably consist of Belarus and I think also arguably Ukraine. The reason I say arguably Ukraine is because a big part of why Ukraine obviously wants to be very separate from Russia is A, because of its modern day autocracy, and also because a lot of its imperial history was basically about suppressing Ukrainian identity. And so I think in this timeline here, where it's a much more liberal empire, I think that the Ukrainian people would have done one of two things. Either one, they would have just gone in peace and been independent, or two, they would have been like, you know what, we're close enough to the Russians as it is. We don't feel the need to kind of overthrow this imperialist yoke and like this history, and therefore, let's just stay within Russia. So I think that ends the scenario, and I hope that I did a good job of doing this part 2 for you guys. And let me know in the comment section what you think of how I did. I promise I will try to respond to you at some point. And of course, if you like what you saw already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified. Also, don't forget to stay tuned for our next video, which is going to be something along the lines of what if Victoria and Alexander married? In other words, we're going to be looking at Princess Victoria from England and Tsarevich Alexander, who would later become Tsar Alexander II of Russia. So what we're going to be doing when we look at that is basically look at, well, we're going to be looking at a bit of an unrealistic scenario, but it's still very interesting because the two of them had a very close relationship when they were in their youth. So definitely stay tuned for that video, and in the meantime, have a great day and bye.